Summer may be winding down,
We're trying to be responsible, respectful boaters.
but a water war is still heating up.
We have one boat that goes back and forth and back and forth.
You are videotaping 10-year-olds.
I don't think anybody is going after their kids.
This week on Open Record,
A lot of people say, well, you're just trying to ban wake boats. That's not true at all.
how big waves
Trying to enjoy the lake like everybody else.
on small lakes
It's not meant to be a personal issue.
are pitting neighbor against neighbor.
Let's get this ordinance passed before our lake is truly destroyed.
From the FOX6 studios, this is Open Record. I'm Brian Polson. I'm joined by Open Record's executive producer, Sarah Smith. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
And we are joined this week by Contact Six's Jenna Sachs. Hello, Jenna.
Hey there.
We are recording this episode on Wednesday, September 18th, 2024. Exactly 3 months ago, we talked on this very podcast about a growing controversy on Wisconsin lakes, a sport known as wake surfing. It relies on sophisticated power boats that are becoming more popular. They create artificially enhanced waves for surfing and wakeboarding. It's growing in popularity, but it's also stirring up conflict among lake users and property owners all over the state of Wisconsin. A war being waged one small town at a time. And we'll talk about one place where it's getting personal when we come right back.
Welcome back to Open Record. If you're not familiar with wake surfing, you can go back and listen to episode 324 titled Kings of the Lake. But Brian, can you give us a quick reminder? What is wake surfing and why is it becoming controversial?
You know, I just go back to earlier this year, I had no idea what wake surfing was. I like lakes. I like to be on them. I've gone water skiing before. I don't have a boat. I don't spend a lot of time. So this was not something familiar to me. You may recall the last time this actually came up when my dermatologist brought it up at an appointment and said, hey, have you heard about this? Well, he had a friend who's part of a group called Lakes at Stake, and they are actually fighting what they say is the damage that's being done by wake boats all over the state of Wisconsin. So wake surfing is essentially just surfing on a small surfboard behind a boat.
You don't need an ocean.
You don't need an ocean. You can do it right here in the state of Wisconsin. Of course, we have thousands. You know, they call Minnesota the land of 10,000 lakes. We have 16,000 named lakes, or identified lakes, I should say. I don't know if they're all named. But we have lots of lakes here in Wisconsin. So a lot of water, rivers, a lot of places to play. But in recent years, a new sport has emerged where you can be behind a boat if it has a big enough wave, or the wake, which is the you know, as the boat's going forward, the thrust leaves the waves behind it. And if the waves are big enough, you can ride this surfboard without a tow rope and just surf right along those waves. It does look like a lot of fun, I have to admit. It looks like a blast. But the size of those waves, the energy from those waves, and what's happening underneath the water has created quite a bit of controversy, as other lake users say the big waves are disrupting their enjoyment of the lake. Lake property owners say it's disrupting their shorelines, and they're concerned about what's happening on the bottom of the lake if the thrust that's going down is stirring up sediment and things like that. So there are a lot of concerns about both the environmental damage and sort of the enjoyment factor, and that has led to a lot of sort of conflict, passion on both sides of this. People who have invested a lot of money in these boats that can do this, because it takes some special features to be able to create a wave big enough to surf and with the right shape. But on the other side, people who are frustrated by the experience they're getting when they're around these boats.
How is the boat making waves that big, and why is that problematic? Because you mentioned you hadn't heard about this beforehand, but when I saw the visuals, I thought, oh, I've seen that. I just didn't know what it was.
Well, the thing is, if you don't know much about power boats, and I know, all I know is they go fast and they make waves behind them. I've gone
Big
water.
motors,
if you've been water skiing before, you've been tubing, or you've seen people do it, you know that they will maybe glide back and forth with that tow rope and jump across the wave once in a while. But those waves are typically intentionally not very big. Water skiers like smooth water. They want to ski on glass if they can, because it's better for skiing. Tubing, it might be fun to jump a little bump, but you don't want to jump something too big. So how do you make a wave big enough that you can just literally ride it? If you think of like a California surfer riding a tube all the way in to shore, you need the power of the wave to propel you forward. So unlike a tow rope that pulls you, you need a wave that can actually push you in the water. To do that, many of these new power boats come equipped with special ballast tanks. They are essentially empty tanks inside the hull of the boat, and they are designed to draw in lake water that adds weight to the boat when it's on the water. The heavier the boat, the bigger the wave. There are some other features. One is a shaping plate, which can push that wake to one side instead of splitting it evenly on both sides. So you essentially sort of double the size of the wave by going in one direction. So now you have the heavier boat. The hulls are also shaped in a certain way that makes for these bigger waves. It's being pushed to one side. And then on top of all of that, they ride these boats at a speed that is intentionally slow enough. And this was counterintuitive to me at first. I thought, well, they must be going really fast. It's the opposite. They're going really slow. So if you've ever been on a boat and you see as the boat starts to power up, the bow of the boat points upward as it's starting to go. And eventually when it gets up to speed, it levels out. That's called planing. When the boat levels out, it creates less of a wave. But when it is still in that pre-planing, they call it a transition speed. When it's in that mode, it creates a bigger wave. So all of those factors combine to create these surfable waves. And it's that transition speed that leads to some of the other concerns, which is the way that boat is pointing and what's happening as the thrust goes down.
Well, in addition to how the boat is built in the back end, there's also the tanks, right? So you mentioned that they fill up with water, which obviously weight the back end of the boat down. But the problem that I've learned from your stories is that those don't empty fully when you get out of the water.
And that's a big concern for some of the people who have ecological concerns about lakes. Ask anyone from, and we have a guest joining us later from the Department of Natural Resources, anyone in the sort of natural resources area, the concerns about invasive species in our lakes, whether it's Lake Michigan or inland lakes, it's a huge concern, whether it's zebra mussels or quagga mussels or various spiny water fleas and things like that. The concern is that if you transport water from one lake to another lake, you may be transporting those invasive species. These new wake boats are designed with ballast tanks that cannot be completely emptied by design. You can actually do damage to the internal components of the boat, I'm told. I'm not an expert. I don't make boats. But because they can't be completely drained, you risk going from one lake to another and then transporting that lake water to another lake and maybe transporting invasive species. There's been discussion about, well, should these boats be inspected before they go to a new lake? But that's a challenge, and we'll talk to DNR about that because the way these are designed, there's no easy way to look inside and see if the ballast tanks have been completely emptied out before they go to a new lake. So that's another big concern, is the invasive species.
Your story had some really pretty drone shots in it of this more shallow lake, and behind the boat,
Tim Primo.
You could see like a trail of brown where the sediment was getting stirred up beneath the boat. So it seems like something is certainly happening.
Yeah, and that actually was not drone shots that we took. I should give credit to an organization called Lakes at Stake, which has been taking these drone shots as well. And that video that you saw was an example of what happens behind these boats, but that actually occurred at Pewaukee Lake. Pewaukee Lake, which we went out on for our original story, has two essentially large sides to it, and one side is much deeper than the other. The deeper side is really where more of the wake surfing type activity goes on, but on the other side of the lake, which is closer into the village of Pewaukee downtown, is shallower. And so when wake surfing boats are at transition speed on the shallower side, if they're in maybe say 8 to 10 feet of water, they stir up that bottom sediment. You see that trail of brown. That is the lake bottom that's being stirred up. It's being disturbed. The concerns, many fishermen have concerns that is messing with fish habitats and that could be messing with other parts of sort of the lake ecology. That's something that is a concern really statewide, but that was one of those visual examples of what can happen when they're in shallow water. The lake that we talked about in this particular story that's airing, we record on Wednesday the 18th, it's airing tonight. By the time you see this or hear this, it will have aired already on Fox 6 News. That lake has a mean depth. It's Blue Spring Lake in Palmyra, a mean depth of 7 feet. So
not very deep.
It's not very deep, and that's one of the big concerns there. For all of the other concerns, one of their biggest for the residents there is that they are concerned about their lake bottom being churned up.
Well, and this isn't just about supporters of the boats or people that say that these aren't causing a huge problem and it's just recreation. It's not just them versus the people that live on the lakes or the people that live in the town. Bills actually made its way to Madison about it.
Yeah, there was legislation that was introduced late fall of 2023, and that would have set sort of the first statewide. There are no current state laws that specifically address wake boats or wake surfing. It would have been the first law to address that and regulate it, which would that proposal from last fall would have set a 200-foot minimum distance that you could operate a wake surfing boat at that transition speed from shore. And that is, I believe, it also one of the things that really troubles people who are concerned about wake boats is that would have eliminated all of the other local ordinances that have already been designed to tackle this issue at various lakes across the state. So the 200-foot distance is something that the water sports industry and the boating industry, the boat manufacturers, want. They say we recognize there has to be something in place. They want a standard across the state, but they want to get rid of all these local ordinances and just have one statewide standard. Shortly after that bill was introduced, which was supported by the water sports industry, another bill was introduced earlier in 2024 that would have set a 700-foot minimum distance. It also would have said these boats can't operate at that transition speed in less than 20 feet of water. Many of the people who supported that bill now say research shows it ought to be even deeper than that. It ought to be 30 feet of water. So they want a 700-foot buffer, 30 feet of water, and they want to make sure that these boats can't operate in any lake smaller than 1,500 square.
Do we know how many that is in the state?
Acres. That's, when we did the story back in June, we actually looked at the DNR's list of lakes and what sizes are. Yeah. And based on the information listed on the DNR website, out of 16,000 lakes in Wisconsin, 77 lakes would be big enough for wake surfing. It's not a lot, but for those who say we're concerned about lake health, there needs to be that kind of distance, they say that's just the way it's got to be. Now, of course, that raises another concern, which is if you only have 77 lakes where you can do this, all wake surfers are going to go to those lakes. Go there. So Pewaukee Lake would be one where you could then do it. That means there's going to be even more wake boat traffic at Pewaukee Lake. So in some ways, it's counterintuitive for the folks on, say, a lake like that. They might say that's worse. Yeah. But for those who are concerned about overall ecological health in the state, they say that's the way it ought to be.
So obviously, there's some controversy over this. It seems like it's even dividing some lake communities into two groups. How are they reacting on different sides? You know, the boating industry on one and the water sports industry, and then these groups trying to protect the lakes on the other. How are they reacting to these efforts to control the issue, implement laws?
It is I would say it is a passionate issue for a lot of people. People have a lot of feelings about this. When we ran this story back in June, I've not had a story on Fox 6 News that went as viral online as this one did immediately. And I believe on YouTube, it currently has something in the neighborhood of 300,000 views. For a news story, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
And because it's something that a lot of people are interested in, and it gets shared in various groups, and then it goes on from there. While there's been state legislation, nothing came of it. Those bills died. And the legislature's been out of session all summer as a whole other voting season has gone on. So what's happening is all across the state, small town after small town, lake district after lake district is taking this up. And you've got small groups of people, maybe a couple of hundred people who live on a small lake, who are all sort of debating, should we ban wake boats? Should we restrict them in some way? Should we set limitations? And then people on those lakes who've invested in these boats say, wait a minute, you're going to force me to go somewhere else. I live here. My family lives here. This is what we do. And that was the focus of our story that aired Wednesday night, that will be airing tonight as we record this. More than 100 people packed a park pavilion to debate a proposed wake ordinance at Blue Spring Lake in Palmyra. This was in August. The controversy there is getting personal, and we're going to talk about that when we come right back.
We're back on Open Record. Earlier this summer, Brian, you get a call, and that's kind of how a lot of stories start, right? So you get a call or an email, but this is a call from someone concerned that a 13-year-old wakeboarder is being targeted by people living in a small lake community. So what happened there, and what was that about, and how did you follow up on it?
Remember, my initial tip comes from someone who's on the sort of the side of the people concerned that wake boats are doing all sorts of damage. This actually comes from someone who's concerned that a family of wakeboarders is being targeted, and the person who reached out said, hey, it's this small lake in Palmyra. It's southeastern Jefferson County, just west of Waukesha County. And they say this guy, Corey Kincaid, he has 3 boys. They've grown up on Blue Spring Lake. They're competitive wakeboarders. And some of the residents there are filming them as they wake surf. And there's a lot of controversy. People don't want them to be doing this on the lake. So I contact Corey Kincaid. As I said, he's got these 3 sons. The oldest is a 13-year-old who's a competitive wakeboarder. He's won some competitions. He doesn't wake surf. He's a wakeboarder. but the boat does use ballast for him to get bigger waves to wakeboard. So sort of regardless of the sport, the people at the lake say their concern is he's using ballast. That makes the boat heavier. It makes the waves bigger. This particular lake is small. It's 150 acres, and trying to get an idea of how big is 150 acres. We did get that drone shot in the story. You can see the whole lake in one shot.
Yeah.
It's not a very big lake. And so there's not much room for a wake boat to navigate to keep pulling someone and doing, the wakeboarding. So he keeps making these sort of repeated passes in the same place. Yeah. And there's one particular neighbor who's raised the most concern about this, a guy named Ryan Tobias, who we interviewed. And he says that one boat, it was interesting for the story. We actually ride along with Corey Kincaid. He shows us his boat. He shows us the boys. He says, I think it's unfair the way they're being treated. We're worried that we're sort of being singled out. And I think there are 2 other wake boats on that lake, but they're the most active with the wakeboarding. And we get done with that ride along on the boat. And then I go to interview Ryan Tobias, who I know is concerned about wake boats. And as I'm interviewing him, he says, we've got this one boat out there that keeps doing these passes back and forth and back and forth. And I said, you mean the boat I was just on? He goes, yeah, the boat you were just on. So this is one neighbor who's singling out this other neighbor. And you can feel that this is a big statewide issue that's getting really, really personal. Mm-hmm. And while Ryan Tobias is clear, he said it's not personal. It's not about this family. We're concerned about the potential damage to the lake. They believe they're seeing damage already to the lake bottom as things are coming up from the lake bottom that are floating in that they think are evidence of this. And you have Corey Kincaid saying, look, we're just out here trying to have a good time in the lake like everybody else. We're trying to be responsible boaters, and we feel singled out.
So these neighbors feel like they're seeing damage. Is there study or any sort of research that backs that up?
There's no study of this lake that shows that they're seeing sort of more anecdotal evidence. There was, I think, there was some sort of chunk of the bottom, they say, that was discovered and brought in by someone who's doing some lake maintenance, and they believe that was evidence of damage being caused by the wake boat. They can't prove that that's what it is. That's what they believe is going on. As I said, though, it's a 7-foot mean depth. It's not a very deep lake. So there may well be reason to believe that lake thrust could be, or the downward thrust could be causing that. But I'm not an expert. I'm not a scientist. There is no science on this lake. But in terms of science, there are studies. There is research that's looking at this issue. And most of that research has been commissioned by groups that are interested in protecting lakes from damage. And they have studied things like wave energy, wave height. The University of Minnesota had a study, the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory, one of the best known studies. Also, a study was done in Waukesha County. The lake name is escaping me right at the moment. I should know it off the top of my head. I'm not going to try to say it if I don't have it right, but I believe Carroll University was involved in that study as well. But there have been a couple of things that have looked at this, and they're looking at comparing wake boat wave energy to the energy from ski boats or other types of vessels. And they're seeing that the energy is much greater from those waves. So they're concluding that a safe distance from shore for wake boat operation should be much greater than for other boats. And the people who are advocating for those things are taking it maybe, they're taking it out to that 700-foot level. The research hasn't said 700 feet is the safe level or the safe distance. It's just showing the energy is different. What the research has not done yet is actually study damage. Are we seeing ecological damage that can be tied to wake surfing or wake boats? No one's done that yet. In many ways, the damage is theoretical in terms of we see the greater wave energies and therefore predict that it must be causing these things. You get anecdotal stories at various lakes of people saying we're seeing the shoreline eroding and we think it must be the wake boats. Or at Big Cedar Lake, we have one resident there who's part of Lakes at Stake who actually has recorded video of his lake bottom near where he lives. And 10 years ago, it was lush and green and had all sorts of aquatic life. And now it looks like this barren sort of lake desert. But I asked him when we did the story the first time, can you prove that wake boats caused that? And he said, no, I can't. But I believe that that's one of the factors. So while it's being presented everywhere as this is evidence that it's causing this problem, they can't prove that that's what it is. So I think there's still work to be done in terms of the science. Yeah. And there are groups that are studying this from the industry's perspective.
I was going to say, is anything forthcoming?
Well, the industry has studied this, and they've looked at it and said, actually, There's minimal damage being done. 200 feet is plenty, but that has been funded by groups that have a financial interest in the boating industry, like the National Marine Manufacturers Association. I think it was actually Mercury Marine, which makes boat engines.
Right.
So you've got sort of this dueling research. There's one more piece of research that is supposed to be coming out. A lot of people are waiting for. Back to St. Anthony Falls Laboratory in Minnesota, University of Minnesota. A phase 2 study that's looking specifically at that downward prop wash from these boats. What effect is it having on lake bottoms? That research has been anticipated for a long time now. Some people thought it was going to come out in early 2024, then maybe later in 2024, then maybe before the end of the year. And I was just told by a university spokesperson this week, breaking this news, they now say they expect to publish that research in early 2025. So there's still a wait for that to come out. Not clear why it's been delayed, but they have not yet published the research, and University of Minnesota doesn't want to talk about it until they're ready to publish. So we're still waiting on that.
The one of the things we do as journalists and reporters who are trying to figure out, okay, is it worth going to this school board meeting? Is it worth going to this other village board meeting? They look at the agenda. It's typically posted ahead of time. Back in August, the Lake District published an agenda for their annual board meeting. And one of the things was new ordinance listed for possible action.
Yeah.
That caused some people to...
That's what really drove that tip that I got was all of a sudden there's on this annual agenda for Blue Spring Lake Management District, there's an item that says, I believe it says possible action or adoption of an ordinance to regulate boating on Blue Spring Lake. And it was referring to the wake boat operation. So there were suddenly people going, whoa, you guys are ready to adopt something. Yeah. We haven't even talked about this. So more than 100 people packed this park pavilion near Blue Spring Lake, Aurelian Springs Park. And it was on a Saturday afternoon, and there's, standing room only outside this park pavilion as people came up to say, hey, what's this all about? Where's the research? What are the facts? We need to know more before we go forward. Others saying we don't have time. We can't wait for the state legislature to act. Our lake is in peril. So you had sort of both sides going. The president of the board actually says right at the beginning of the meeting, knowing we're there with a camera, I made a mistake. It should have said draft. This is a working draft. We need to come to an agreement. That working draft came from an organization called the Last Wilderness Alliance. They are actually helping communities all over the state right now to draft ordinances to regulate what they call wake enhancement. So ballast boating, anything that creates this artificially bigger wake. And they have a template ordinance, which is what this was based on. But each community has to sort of debate what's in that ordinance. Is it right for them? Are there things particular to maybe their lake or their community that they need to tweak? And Blue Spring Lake is now saying we need to look at this more closely. So they actually set up a study committee to look at this for the next 90 days and then make a recommendation. But Jim Hockman, who's the president of the board, told me we don't want to wait any longer than that because even after they approve it at the Lake Management District level, they need the town to approve it. They need the DNR to review it, and they know that's all going to take time. And there's another boating season coming next spring.
Having been in similar circumstances myself, I have to wonder about the dynamic shift when a camera shows up at a Lake District meeting, because that's not something you typically expect a camera at. I have to imagine it makes a tense situation even
Small
more
community.
so. Did people actually speak?
They did. A lot of maybe 24 people actually got up and spoke. What's interesting is there had been a meeting, not an annual meeting, but a meeting on Zoom prior to this, where tensions really flared. And there was a lot more sort of heated conversations, some back and forth accusations. Once our camera showed up, it almost seemed as though that had the opposite effect. Sometimes it works people up. In this case, it seemed to tone people down. The rhetoric was a little calmer. Maybe people didn't want to look like they were a little out of control. Yeah. So it seemed to be like there was a little bit of a more reasonable discussion. I also think, though, the fact that the board president made it clear at the beginning, we're not passing anything today. This is a draft. We need to look at it further. We want to hear all of your voices. I think that also helped to bring the temperature down a little bit, because when people thought they were ready to pass something immediately, that's when the tensions were really high. And I think that backed things down. But again, they made it clear 90 days and we've got to do something. So Blue Spring Lake, it's not done there. These ordinances, though, are raising a lot of questions about if they do pass it. Who's going to enforce it? Is there anything state officials can do to regulate wake surfing in the meantime? When we come back, we have an expert who's going to join us, and I'm really grateful that he is here. He is Wisconsin's boating law administrator, Lieutenant for the Department of Natural Resources, Darren Kuhn, and he'll be with us right after this. We have a special guest this week with us on Open Record. He is joining us live via Zoom. It is Wisconsin DNR Lieutenant Darren Kuhn. He spent more than a quarter century as a conservation warden in Wisconsin, and for the past few years, he's been Wisconsin's boating law administrator. Lieutenant Kuhn, thank you for being here. Really appreciate having you on Open Record.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, I can see it looks like you're in a hotel room, and if I understand, you're in New Orleans right now, actually at the annual conference of the National Association of State Boating Law Administrators. Did I get that right?
That's a mouthful.
You got that right.
Okay.
That was a mouthful.
So you're one of those boating law administrators. I wanted to start off the top real quick. What is a boating law administrator? What do you do? What does that mean?
The short condensed version is for the state of Wisconsin, basically anything to have to do with boating, whether it's boating education, boating training, boating enforcement, boating public relations, safety messaging, all comes through my office.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to ask. I mean, obviously that covers a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of issues when it comes to things like boating. So what are some of the biggest topics and issues for people living in Wisconsin and these boating issues?
Well, clearly, the biggest controversial issue right now is wake surfing, as you guys have been talking about. Safety wise, one of our biggest concerns, however, is people still not having life jackets in their boat or enough life jackets in their boat. That's for our enforcement staff. That's our number one citation issued every summer, is not having life jackets, which is crazy to me because it's not a new law, and it's, they're tried and true to save people's lives, and people yet still go out on the boat without proper life jackets. And then obviously the drinking that goes on is a major safety concern that we try to address.
Lieutenant Kuhn, you mentioned that wake surfing is a really hot topic. Obviously, from Brian's story, emotions are running high on this. Is the DNR able to do anything about it?
There's not a whole lot that the DNR as an agency can do about it. We're definitely involved in the ordinance process. Any local boating ordinance that gets proposed, our staff review it, and that's a common misconception, is that the DNR either approves or denies these ordinances, and that's not the case. We have statutory authority to complete an administrative review. So we review the ordinance, make sure it's consistent with law, try to help the towns or the districts make that ordinance as tight as it can get. And in your earlier segment, you talked about the Last Wilderness Alliance and that ordinance that they're helping communities with. The department worked with the Last Wilderness Alliance to make sure that draft ordinance or that template passed scrutiny. So it's the sort of the gold standard of ordinances right now, and we worked really hard with the Last Wilderness Alliance to get that going. But without any state laws and without any bills to testify towards, we're sort of stuck here.
So when you talk about reviewing these ordinances, that administrative review, are you really just looking for what sort of comports with state law and state regulations, or are you also going to the step of saying this seems to be working well in certain communities, you might want to consider this? Is there sort of an advisory role as well?
Definitely an advisory role. For instance, the ordinance that the Last Wilderness Alliance has passed around about the ballast tanks and with the aquatic invasive concerns. There's a portion of that ordinance that talks about operating in a bow-high manner for a temporary period or something along those lines. And we have suggested, actually putting a distance, something that's better, easier defined, so it's more black and white on, operate in that transition period for a distance of 200 yards or something like that, because most boats, probably all boats, can get through that transition period within 200 yards, when they're trying to plane out.
I want to stay on that for a moment, because at Blue Spring Lake, there was a little bit of a controversy raised over the transition speed portion of this, where some of the residents said, well, I have small children who are learning to water ski, And those children have to go at a slow speed that we can't get up to planing speed. Is that going to mean my kids can't learn to water ski? What's your response to that concern?
Well, my response would be that's going to be something that individual community is going to have to work through in that ordinance creation. And that may be, as you pointed out earlier, one of those things that has to be tweaked specifically for that lake. But that template ordinance generally does have a provision or a caveat to it that it doesn't apply to tubing or water skiing or something along those lines. So there's generally a catch-all in there so that those activities aren't prohibited.
I think I've just imagined from a legal standpoint, that's where this gets tricky, because I do know that I believe there was, I think the Wisconsin Legislative Council had issued some advice on this to Last Wilderness Alliance saying you can't single out wake boats. You have to apply this to everyone. And as long as you apply this to everyone, then this is probably not going to run afoul of the what's the term I'm looking for? Public trust doctrine, which says essentially our lakes and our rivers are governed by a public trust. They're available to all of us to enjoy. So is that one of the, when you're looking at these ordinances, are you looking really carefully at trying to avoid singling out wake boats for activities that maybe other types of boats might also do?
100%. Not only public trust doctrine, but also Article 1 of the Wisconsin Constitution adopts the public trust doctrine. So we're definitely trying to ensure that municipalities and different local units of government don't take their ordinances too far, and ensuring that they're not prohibiting a particular type of boat and focusing more on a particular type of an activity rather than the boat itself.
Does the DNR have a say in whether or not an ordinance is approved? Would you ever advocate for or against something?
We don't advocate either way. It's an administrative review, and we give suggestions. But at the end of the day, it's up to that local unit of government if they're going to take the suggestions and make some amendments, or if they're going to keep it as is. Ultimately, it's going to come down to them. Our goal is to make the ordinance functional, efficient, and easy to understand, and obviously legal. Because everyone has the right to use our waterways, but we need to be safe about it. And these ordinances need to be to the point where someone coming from Milwaukee up to Bayfield can understand it and know that it's there. There's an awful lot of examples where people might violate some rules and they don't even know they're doing it because it's not properly published.
Well, that seems to me, sorry to interrupt, Lieutenant Kuhn, that seems to me to be one of the big concerns here, is that if you have, I think there are 31 ordinances that we're aware of right now, and I'm sure your agency knows of more that are maybe potentially under review, because it seems this is accelerating. This is sort of spreading rapidly. There are 16 that have been passed so far just in 2024 alone. But as you get all these different ordinances around the state, I mean, your agency has to enforce this, or you're the statewide enforcement agency anyway. How do even your own wardens keep track of all of these different ordinances? I mean, if there's one state law, it's one thing. 31 unique ordinances has got to be a challenge to keep up with.
Well, and that brings up an interesting point. And not to correct you, but to correct you.
Go right ahead. Feel free, please.
Yeah, our wardens do not enforce the local boating ordinances. I've learned something new today. Thank you. Yeah. We assist, if requested by the local units of government, but local boating ordinances, or pretty much any local ordinance, specifically talking boating today, is up to the individual municipality. So, like you were talking about Pewaukee, they've got their own boat patrol that they fund, and those are the people that are responsible for enforcing the local boating ordinances. And that has drawn some controversy on the whole local boating ordinance topic, especially in the more rural communities where they don't have an enforcement arm within their township to enforce their own ordinances, which has drawn some controversy.
I think Blue Spring Lake is an example. They don't have their own boat patrol. They had a constable many years ago, but it would be the Jefferson County sheriff's department, if I understand correctly, that would enforce that. So the question was, how do you do it? You know, if you see someone out there wakeboarding or wake surfing with ballast, you call the sheriff and they've got to come out and respond and observe it themselves, or do you take pictures? That seems to have raised some real questions. Yeah.
It raises a ton of questions. The first one, especially in that specific example, is while the sheriff has the ability to enforce local ordinances, does the sheriff intend to enforce local boating ordinances? While they do have a boat patrol, that there's some sheriff's departments and some sheriffs around the state that have said, our deputies are going to worry about state law and county ordinances, and they're not necessarily going to get that deep into it with the local town ordinances, or some require some contracts between the town and the county. Some just freely do it. So for a lot of these ordinances, that's one of our points in our administrative review, especially in those areas that don't have local boat patrols, is have you talked to the local sheriff? Because if you're relying on the sheriff to enforce your local boating ordinance, you probably want to check with that sheriff before you put pen to paper.
You mentioned earlier people taking their boats from one side of the state to the other, and Brian raised in his story concerns about the transferring of invasive species, making sure to remove all the water and the weeds from these boats. How do you enforce that right now?
It's very tricky with the wake surfing boats, because as mentioned earlier, while there's data out there that shows that they can't be bone dry, there's no inspection ports or nothing that you can really look at to see if there's any water in those boats. They all have gauges, and the gauges are going to say empty, but we know from information that's out there that there's going to be water, and there a varying degree of water, but without that physical evidence or that proof, there's not a whole lot that, the laws that we currently have on the books with invasive species, we can't just suspect that somebody has water in there. We have to be able to prove that they're transporting water, and without being able to see it, that makes that practically impossible.
I'm curious, is your agency currently, how much of your workload right now is doing these administrative reviews as more and more communities are asking for this assistance? Is it bogging you down in something that the legislature could potentially take up on its own?
I wouldn't say it's bogging us down, but it's definitely a workload. Me in particular, I honestly talk wake surfing every day of the week, whether it's February or August. It doesn't really matter. I'm talking wake surfing with somebody. But our staff, with the review of the ordinance, some areas of the state, it's a far bigger workload than others. Up north, in that Vilas County area, that's crazy nuts right now. The southeast, in the more populated areas, there's a lot of conversation, and it's very interesting, or at least I find it interesting, in that the amount of conversation versus the amount of ordinances that are actually being passed is not symmetric. We're talking far more reviews than ordinances actually being passed. So there's definitely some communities that want the added regulation, and others that certainly don't.
Well, I don't want to keep you any longer, because I know that we've got to get you off. You've got more to do at this conference in New Orleans, but I just want to tell you, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I literally called you yesterday. You're out of town and you said, I'll do it. And this is such an important and hot topic right now that I just can't thank you enough for coming here on Open Record. Thank you, Lieutenant.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, we will go off the record when we come right back. And it is time for us to go off the record. This is the part of the podcast where we get a little more casual and have a little fun by answering a question for which we have done no preparation. But of course, Sarah Smith has. What do you have for us, Sarah?
I sure have. You should have added a line in there where we get a little bit more self-deprecating, because that's today.
That's every day.
So, okay, today's question. We're going to have to dig a little deep here. Or maybe not. What's the most obnoxious thing about you?
Are we supposed to answer what we think other people would say?
Yeah.
Or what we actually think it is?
Maybe.
Oh gosh, I don't want to know what you think of other people.
No. I'm not going to say Jenna's this. No.
What do I think? Yeah, right. No, that would be.
But I mean, I can start. I have two things. I think one. Just two. One, I talk very loudly. I'm always cranked 2 out of 10. I don't have a whisper voice. Anytime if we're somewhere public and I need to say something maybe snarky to my husband, he's like, everyone can hear you. They probably can. And my laugh is also loud. I also think another obnoxious thing is I'm not very patient. So if I get an email, I have to respond right away. If someone needs an answer, I'm like, let me figure it out. I don't even try to take a beat. And so sometimes I'm annoying because I'm like, hey, did you get that done yet? I'm a chair kicker sometimes.
In your job, you have to be.
Yeah.
I don't know how you would keep up if you weren't.
Right. I know. But
listen, to our listeners, they don't know, our viewers, you don't know what she does on a daily basis and what she keeps up with. It would be impossible if you didn't do it right away.
Right.
It would get buried.
I would probably forget about it.
Would be
Yeah.
gone.
Yeah. So, but I'm very good at like the poking and like, hey, me again. So I mean, I call that kind of obnoxious.
I don't find it obnoxious at all.
Well, that's great. Then I'll keep doing it. Now I only have one thing I'm obnoxious
The only
about.
obnoxious thing about that is that you're always on it. Like you're always correct. I think that is maybe the only annoying
We're going to
part.
archive this podcast.
If I see something and I'm like, I don't have the right answer for that now, so I'm going to wait until I get the right answer to get back, and then that thing gets buried, and I've got I've got the chair kicker going, hey, what happened to the whatever, and I'm like, I meant to look up that information and make that phone call, and so sometimes I'm maybe not as good about that. And in a similar way, I don't know if this is sort of, I'm admitting bad social media form here. Are you guys big likers on social media? Do you like everything?
No.
I'm stingy about likes. Because I think
You
if
don't
I
deserve my
click
like.
I'm making a point of saying that was extra good.
Right.
And love is that was amazing.
Right.
So a lot of comments.
So you're stingy with your hearts.
I read them and I to myself go, oh, interesting. Oh, nice comment. I don't click like. And then I think the person on the other end is like, is he ignoring me? So maybe I'm not as responsive. I think that what I've thought in my head has been conveyed and it hasn't been.
Okay.
Sometimes I have trouble feigning interest in things. Like I really can't fake it as well as I used to. And if you're
the
talking
poker
about
face.
cars or you're talking about most sports, I have a harder time acting like I care. It's like the last 5 years, I'm trying really hard. Like when you told me today that the Brewers were about to clinch, I had no clue.
Right before this podcast.
Well,
Kale
that's
and
good for me to know in case
we were
people
talking
bring
about
it
the
up.
Cubs and Jenna's like, oh, you guys are Cubs fans? And then I had to explain the clinching and all that. So
Right.
it was so you were just glossed over.
There's times where I'm like, don't shut down your brain. Try really hard. Be engaged.
I don't want to steal yours, but I think I do talk loud. I think my voice can
together
be heard
we're not great.
in a lot of. I've always been a very loud talker, and sometimes I think it makes me seem. Maybe, I don't mean to say I'm intimidating, but it might make me seem more intimidating than I am because I speak loudly. I think of it as speaking with like passion and being, and being emphatic and making sure my message is heard. But I think maybe it might come across as
the other thing I do that's really
aggressive.
obnoxious. I have a lot of the same phrases that I say a lot. We were mini golfing with my family and it was about the 8th hole and I talked to the kids because I don't want them like full backswing and we're in mini golf, right? So I must have said it 100 times and my husband goes, everyone gets $1 the next time mom says wackadoo. Because I'll say, all right, Kyle, please don't wackadoo it. Just nice and gentle. But I say it over and over.
Our spouses are allowed to be our worst critics.
Okay,
though.
that's fair.
Yeah, Sarah, I know what mine is. I just realized. No, it's right here. It's this.
Oh,
that sipping sound.
No,
every time I take a drink, I go. I've had people point that out to me.
Like it's the best beverage he has ever had in his life.
Something. I don't. Lindsay, what's your obnoxious
What are
thing?
you obnoxious?
Oh man,
Over 4.
Ooh. I would say I don't laugh at all my husband's jokes. I think, he expects me to, and if it's not good, I'm just not gonna laugh.
See, you know what? Somebody's got to test it on somebody.
You're being stingy with your laugh so that it's authentic when you do.
Because if you laugh at everything, then
I know he can do better. Like that's the thing. Is like I know your ceiling.
I know you have it,
and I know that this isn't it. So like,
wait, what's your husband's name?
Keaton.
Okay, we're gonna work on this joke, Keaton, and I have faith in you.
My favorite phrase on Open Record to date now is,
I know
you're not. This isn't your best, and I know you. How did you put it?
I know you can do better.
I know you can do better. That is marriage advice.
Write that down.
Outstanding. All right, we are going to take a break and wrap things up when we come right back. You have a topic you'd like us to discuss on Open Record or an issue you think we should investigate for Fox 6 News, send us an email to fox6investigators@fox.com. As always, thank you to the people who make this podcast possible, including our executive producer, Sarah Smith, our editor, Dave Machuda, though I think this week it'll be Kale Zimney.
It is
that
Kale
right?
Zimney editing.
And switching the video and making sure that her husband knows that he has greater potential than he's exhibiting.
Oh my gosh.
Lindsay Adel.
He'll never listen after this one.
Does he listen?
No, he doesn't.
Okay.
Unless I send
I'm going to
it
send
to
him a
him.
link.
We'll share it.
Yeah, okay.
We'll share it.
Be sure to send him a link. With that, I'm Brian Polson. We'll be back next week.